Claude Opus 5 costs 17% less per output token than Codex and doubles the context window, and I honestly wasn't expecting both of those gaps to show up at the same time. $25 per million tokens versus 30. Both models just hit major updates, so this is the right time to actually look at what you're paying for. I'm running Claude Opus 5 against Codex across 5 real tests: code accuracy, context, uptime, pricing, and language support, verified sources only, no vendor money involved. And honestly, what surprised me most wasn't the benchmark scores at all. It was the one dimension where Codex has a real concrete edge and it could genuinely shift things for your team's workflow. So this comparison is for developers and teams who are literally choosing between these two right now. Whether you're running agentic pipelines, working with monorepos, or just trying to keep API costs from blowing up. Pick the wrong one and you're either leaving accuracy on the table or overpaying per token every single day. Test 1 is code generation accuracy. And when this goes wrong, it's a real-time sync. You ship a bug the model introduced, you spend hours debugging something it confidently got wrong, and those false positives in code review pile up fast. That's the failure mode we're looking at here. Okay, so what I found is pretty interesting. On Frontier Bench, Claude Opus 5 surpasses every other model, including Codex, and it doubles Opus 4.8's performance. Codex scores a solid 74% on SWE Bench, but Opus 5 has no published SWE Bench number, so I can't do a direct apples-to-apples comparison there. Take this with a grain of salt, because these are different test setups. Frontier Bench is Anthropic's own internal benchmark, so you want to be a little skeptical of vendor-claimed results, and Codex's SWE Bench score is community reported, so they're not really measuring the same thing, and the gap might be smaller than it looks. I was expecting Codex to be closer, given its SWE Bench track record, but Claude Opus 5 takes code generation, and it's not really close on the benchmarks we can compare. Fewer false positives in code review, frontier level accuracy, and that puts Claude Opus 5 up 1-0. Test 2 is context window and large code bases. And when your context window is too small, the model just starts forgetting things. It loses track of files, hallucinates function signatures that exist somewhere else in the repo, and you end up manually chunking code to work around the limit. So here's what I looked at. Claude Opus 5 runs a 1 million token context window, full stop. Codex CLI caps at 400,000 tokens, even though the underlying GPT 5.5 API can technically hit 1 million. That gap is real, and it shows up the moment you're working with a big monorepo. Honestly, I expected Codex to be closer since GPT 5.5 technically supports 1 million tokens, but the CLI just doesn't expose it. Claude Opus 5 wins context window by a factor of 2.5 times in practice, and that makes it 2-0. Test 3 is API availability and uptime. And this one hurts in a very specific way. Your pipeline is running, it's 2 a.m., the model goes down, there's no status page, no ETA, no incident history to check, and you're just stuck waiting with no idea when it comes back. What surprised me here is that Anthropic just doesn't publish uptime data for Claude Opus 5. Codex, on the other hand, has a tracked figure, 99.56% uptime over the last 30 days, with 8 incidents and an average recovery time of 7 hours and 10 minutes. That's a real number I can actually use. Now, just because Anthropic doesn't publish uptime data doesn't mean Claude Opus 5 is less reliable. It might be totally solid, we just can't know. And Codex's 99.56% sounds great, but 8 incidents with a 7-hour average recovery is actually something to think about if you're running a production pipeline. I was expecting one of them to clearly win this, but you can't score what you can compare. Claude Opus 5 has no published uptime number, so this one has to be a tie, and the score stays at Claude Opus 5 2, Codex 0 with 1 tied. Test 4 is pricing and cost effectiveness, and this one compounds fast. If you're running thousands of API calls a day, a $5 per million token difference in output pricing doesn't sound like much until you do the math and realize it's eating your margins every single month. So I looked at the actual numbers. Input tokens are the same, $5 per million for both, but output tokens are $25 per million for Claude Opus 5 versus $30 for Codex. That's 17% cheaper on outputs, and on Cursor Bench, Opus 5 hits within 0.5% of Fable 5 score at half the cost per task. One thing to keep in mind though, Opus 5 has an effort toggle that can vary token usage by up to 3 times, so your actual cost is kind of a black box, depending on how you configure it. And Codex's $100 to $200 per developer per month estimate is a totally different pricing model. So comparing them directly is tricky. Honestly, I thought pricing would be closer, but Claude Opus 5 is just cheaper on output tokens, and that's where the volume lives. It takes the pricing test, and that brings the score to Claude Opus 5 3, Codex 0, with 1 tied. Test 5 is multi-language support. And when a model drops the ball on a language outside its comfort zone, you don't always catch it right away. You get subtly wrong syntax, missing idioms, or framework-specific patterns that just don't work. And you only find out when something breaks in staging. What I found here was pretty frustrating, honestly. Neither Anthropic nor OpenAI publishes any verified data on multi-language or framework coverage for these models. And I looked through the docs, the model cards, community benchmarks, and there's just nothing to go on. Both cards on screen show no published figure. The hard truth is that both models probably handle the major languages just fine in practice, but I'm not going to score a dimension where there's zero verified data. Anecdotally, both get used across Python, TypeScript, Go, and Rust all the time, but that's not the same as a real benchmark. I was expecting at least one of them to have published language coverage data, but neither does, so this one's another tie. Final score, Claude Opus 5.3, Codex 0, 2 tests tied, and no winner on multi-language support, because there's genuinely nothing to compare. All right, so here's where Claude Opus 5 clearly wins. It's got a 1 million token context window versus Codex CLI's 400,000. Output tokens are 17% cheaper at $25 per million. It leads on Frontier Bench over every other model, including Codex, and its code review finds fewer false positives. Now here's where Codex wins. It's got transparent, tracked uptime at 99.56% with a full incident history you can actually check, established benchmark scores on S2E, Bench, and Human Eval that the community has verified, and its monthly per developer pricing is way easier to budget for a team. All right, so here's the decision rule. I went in thinking this would be closer, and it wasn't. If you need frontier accuracy, a 1 million token context window for monorepos, and cheaper output tokens at scale, go with Claude Opus 5, $25 per million on outputs, full stop. If you need predictable monthly costs, transparent uptime data, and established benchmarks your team can point to, Codex is still a solid choice.